Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is a great pleasure for me to be here, to see all those people who are interested to hear our story still, and young people, older people, survivors, and it's a wonderful opportunity. I came this time to New York just for 4 days. When I was on the plane on Tuesday, I watched the movie, was called Jackie, and it was, of course, Kennedy's assassination. And I was actually very interested how this young woman, married with 2 little kids, was able to cope with that situation, and how she was shaping her life afterwards. Unfortunately, it stopped. It doesn't show that she became Mrs. Onassis and all that. I would have been interested how this, because the film was showing it was really completely shattered. And she had a conversation with her priest, because her Kennedys are a very Catholic family, and she asked him, Father, could you explain to me the meaning of life? And he thought for a minute, and then he said, I don't really know, I can't give you an answer. And I'm actually very interested in how people are able to cope with terrible losses, with terrible experiences. And I must say, most of the survivors have overcome this. But I see now young people having with little problems, not being able to cope with life. And that is something I'm really puzzled about. I can't tell you, I've got given 25 minutes, I can't give you, of course, my whole story, but I have always been questioning, why me? Why was I a survivor and not, for instance, Anne Frank, who was much more talented than me, or my own brother, Heinz, who was killed when he was 18. He was a wonderful musician, a painter in hiding. He couldn't make music, so he started to paint, a poet, a wonderful person, and he didn't survive. So I just will tell you a few examples of miracles which happened to me. So we were arrested on my 15th birthday in Amsterdam, and taken immediately to the holding camp and sent to Auschwitz within a week. And we were arrested in our clothes which we wore, and in the holding camp in Westerbork, kind person gave my mother a hat and coat. I was just in the dress I'd been arrested in. And after arriving in Auschwitz, Mengele appeared. First selection was taking place, and my mother gave me this hat and coat, and I didn't want it. It was a hot day, and she said, yes, keep it, perhaps later, very questionable. It might become useful. So I put it on, and then when Mengele came, looking at everybody for a fraction of a second, deciding right or left, life or death, his head had a big rim, and he looked at me again for half a second and couldn't really see how young I was. That is how I escaped the first selection. Later on, when we were taken to the different work commandos, Canada, I don't know if you know this expression, that was a place where all the belongings which were confiscated from the Jewish people, from all the transport, was sorted out. It was, Canada was a nickname meaning luxury and good life. It was no luxury nor good life, but we were slightly better as otherwise. And when we were picked out for work, and that was actually just the time in June 1944 when all the Hungarian Jews were picked up. And so they needed more people to work in this Canada, because every day huge transport came of these unhappy people. For them, there was mainly no selections. Most of them went straight to the gas chambers. So the SS came and picked more people for this work, and he looked at me, and he said to the couple who was standing next to him, Canada. And I'd heard about it, and I knew it was better, and I was petrified that I would be separated from my mother and perhaps never find her again. So I had a chutzpah. I said in German, kann meine Mutter auch kommen? Can my mother come too? The mouth of the capo and the SS just, how dare she speak to an SS man? But I think he was so in shock that he looked at my mother, who was a very attractive woman, didn't look too good with her shaved head, but still. And he said, yeah, auch Canada. So, and that certainly helped us. For 3 weeks we worked there, because you found food, you found all kinds of things. And the other miracle was that we had even a lunch break. We could find food and we could just eat that. I sat with my back against the barrack across an electrified barbed wire, and I saw a man who looked familiar to me from the distance, and I looked again, and it was my father. Unbelievable, because, you know, men had been gone to Auschwitz, we were in Birkenau. I didn't know if he was selected, if he was still alive. And he told me that my brother was all right as well at that time. And he asked me, and I told him where I was working, and he asked me, can you get me some cigarettes? And I said, but you don't smoke. So he said, yes, but it's a wonderful bargain material. So I did find plenty of packets of cigarettes, which I threw over the fence when the guard was just not looking there. And so it helped him as well to survive a bit longer. The second miracle, and this was really unbelievable, it must have been perhaps September, October. We came, and once a week we had a shower. We came out of the shower naked, and there stood Mengele with his SS, and the selection was taking place. I passed and put me to the good side. My mother was behind me. She had to turn around a few times in front of him, and he decided she was not able to work anymore. With 40 of our Dutch transport women were taken aside. They walked naked out of the barrack, and they were going to be gassed. You can imagine that was for me the most horrible, horrible moment. For 3 months, I thought I'd really lost her. It became winter. It was freezing, freezing cold. Sometimes I lost my shoes when I walked in the snow. I had frostbite on my toes. I was really on the point of giving up. I said, you know, I just can't go through this winter. It's impossible. And I was sitting we were working, it was called Weberei, weaving. We had to make plats. There was big heaps of material thrown on the table. We had to tear it in strips, and we had to plait 200 meters. And it was tested if it was strong enough. If you didn't do 200 meters, a couple of times you were taken out and killed. If the plaits broke, a few times when they tested it, again you were killed. With frozen hands we sat there. It was practically impossible to make this. So many of our workers just every day disappeared. And I really thought, well, I just can't go on anymore. And a couple came and called me out. Somebody wants to see you outside. I said, well, that's it now. And they go outside, and who stands there? My father. This was really never ever happened to anybody, that a man came with his SS boss. He explained to me. He told me he was working in a timber yard. He was a very, very clever man. He told me Heinz was okay still. And then his question, where is Mutti? And I burst into tears, and I said, she's been selected. I saw my father fall to bits in front of my eyes. I think this was for him the worst thing he has ever heard. He came still to see me 3 times, and I never ever saw him again. It became really cold, it was winter, but that helped me. He told me Heinz was all right. He said, we'll be together again as a family. The war will soon be finished, but without Mutti. And then some people came from another part of the camp. At that time, the Germans had evacuated most of the camp because the Russians were approaching. We didn't know anything, not how the war was going at all. We had no idea that the Russians were approaching. But the Germans knew. So every day they emptied the camp. Those were, of course, later called the death marches, where most people perished. But so the guards had fled as well. The different camps were open. People could go from one camp to the other camp. And some Dutch people from our transport came to see me. And they said they'd seen my mother. And I didn't want to believe it. I thought they want to cheer me up. They said, no, 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 she's in this part of the camp. See if you can get there and you will see her. Which eventually I succeeded to do. And indeed, she was there. Through a most amazing story, she was saved. And then, of course, we stayed together. The camp became smaller and smaller. There was no more work commandos because most of the Nazis had fled. And it became January, and every night and daytime the camp was emptied, and there were only about 3 barracks still with people, and the command was going on. When we are leaving, we are going, everybody has to march with us, and when we are leaving, we are going to lock up the barracks and burn down the whole camp. And so my mother and me in the night as well, we were going to march, walked outside to march, and then there was an air raid. And the whole night it was march inside us. They didn't want to march in the air raids. And we were so tired that we said, well, they won't go anyway, let's just stay in when they call out next day. And we fell asleep, completely exhausted. And we woke up in the morning, no shouting, no dogs barking, and the Nazis had fled. And, and we were behind. And we stayed. Many, many people still perished from illness and weakness. And then the Russians came to liberate us. I know Russia is not very popular, not in America, not in the whole world at the moment, but especially we Jews, we owe a lot to the Russian people. Because the main war was really fought on Russian soil. And the Russians looked after us very, very well because there was fierce fighting in Poland, and because the Germans didn't want the Russians to come into Germany, and so they took us away from there. But before that, I went to Auschwitz, a man camp, to look for my father and brother. And there were as well about 300-400 men left behind there. And I looked all over the place, and I came across a man who looked a little bit familiar, but very, very ashen and very, very thin, and were quite ill. And I went over to him and I think I do know you. He said, yes, I'm Otto Frank, Anna's father. And you're Eva Geiringer? I said, yes, yes. Have you seen my father? Have you seen my brother? Yes, they were there, but they marched with the Germans. And he asked me, of course, the first question, have you seen my wife or my daughters? And I hadn't seen them, because Birkenau was actually much, much bigger than Auschwitz. And so so Otto as well traveled with us the whole way. For 4 months we traveled eastward with the Russians till we ended up in Odessa, and there we waited for the end of the war. And when that came, there was, of course, great jubilation that we had made it. But we were all very, very anxious to get back to where we came from, to find out what had happened to our family. Eventually, a New Zealand troop transport ship came and brought us back to Marseille, and then a long journey up to the Netherlands, and we got into Amsterdam, and there we waited for news. And eventually, we got a letter from the Red Cross, quite cool, saying to my mother, we have to tell you that your husband, Erich Geiger, and your son, Heinz Geiger, with exact birth dates and everything, didn't make it. They died in Mauthausen, a terrible Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. That was for me the last straw. I became very, very, very depressed and had difficulty really functioning anymore. Because I had survived, well, if you see, there were many, many miracles, but as well, I was 15 years old. I really wanted to live and have a family, have children, and hopefully be together again as a family. But when I realized that will never ever happen, I became very, very depressed. Wherever I speak, and we have questions from the audience, people always, especially in America, ask me, did you have counseling? And I said, well, in 45, when we came back from the camps, that was not an option. So, you know, that is something we had to work out through ourselves. And I did. I got married. I have got 3 wonderful daughters, 5 grandchildren. I was married to my husband, not a survivor from the camp, but a young man whose father was taken in Dachau very early, and the family were able to get to Palestine. So he became an Israeli and came to London to study economics, and we fell in love, and he asked me to marry him. And I was in England for 1 year. I was going to be a photographer, and when he asked me, I said, no, thank you. Because I had a widowed mother in Amsterdam, and when my year is over, I'm going to go back to Amsterdam. And then Otto Frank, who kind of kept an eye on me, came to visit me in London, and I told him this, and he got a little bit embarrassed, and he said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love, and once you get settled, we like to get married. So I went back to this young man and said, well, you can marry me now, which he was very happy. And we went in 1952 to Amsterdam, got married because we didn't know anybody in England, and we decided we would stay in England. And Otto and my mother were married for 27 years, and I've never seen a happier marriage than those 2 people. Well, this is, and I didn't speak for 40 years, not to my children, not to my husband. It was too hard. You know, I didn't want to burden them with this, what had happened to me. But my youngest daughter, now she resents it. She said, you should have told me. And I said, well, if you wanted to know, you could have always asked. She said, no, that I couldn't do. So you see, that is still a problem. And of course, we are now worried. We are all getting elderly, and we won't be here very long anymore. And who is going to carry on the story? But we have now a solution. We have now my hologram, so many people will have seen me already. And I'm very, very grateful to the Shoah Foundation. It was all an idea of the Shoah Foundation to come up with this wonderful project. And it's a new thing now, and it's going to be many, many Holocaust survivors are still being interviewed, so that we'll have a big choice from different camps, from ghettos, and from all different situations, because every person, every survivor have got their own story to tell. So, but through an Anne Frank exhibition, I started to talk in 1986. and haven't stopped since. So I've written 3 books. The first is Eva's story, which has become very much translated in many other languages, not as much as a diary, but it's still not doing very badly. And then I wrote a book, it's called The Promise, which is really my brother's story. Because, you know, Anne Frank said in one of her letters in the diary, when she dies, she would like to live on. And that's actually what we all want to do. But my brother, being so artistic, when he was 12 years old, he asked my father once, "Papi, what will happen when I die?" And my father was thinking, he said, "Well, when you have children, you live on in your children." And then this 12-year-old boy said, "But what if I die before I have any children?" And my father thought a moment, and he said, we are all a link in a chain which goes from generation to generation. Nothing is lost. Even if you have a short life, somebody will remember what you have done. So you will never be forgotten. Well, he had to accept that. So, and very often my mother, who worked with Otto continuously on promoting the diary, very often we said, what about Heinz? Nobody knows who he was, what a wonderful young man he was, with such a great talent as well. And so I decided to write a book called The Promise. And then a few years ago, I got a commission. I didn't want to write anything else anymore, commissioned to write another book. And they said the title should be After Auschwitz. And that is because a lot of things have happened after Auschwitz as well. But then they said, well, you can't just start in the middle of your life. You should really include your whole life. And so that is a very comprehensive book. So, well, this is more or less my story in a nutshell. And thank you very much for listening. And and I hope many of you will come tonight to see the hologram. And Davina, who was the filmmaker of this wonderful documentary, 116 Cameras, which nearly got an Oscar. Unfortunately, we just missed it by a little bit. We'll be there and we'll give again sort of an explanation, a little talk. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.